I still remembered the precise way the key turned in the front door lock that Tuesday night. It was an ordinary, cheap brass lock on a standard suburban deadbolt, but in the silence of a rainy October evening in Ohio, it sounded like a gunshot. I had been on the road for 6 hours, driving back from a collapsed real estate conference in Chicago that was supposed to last until Friday. The rain had been hammering my windshield the entire way down I-65, the wipers pushing away sheets of gray water while I listened to some mindless true crime podcasts just to keep my eyes open. I was exhausted down to my bones, smelling like stale gas station coffee and damp wool, but there was a stupid, warm comfort in knowing I was finally home. I was looking forward to sneaking into bed next to Clara, feeling the familiar warmth of her back against my chest, and waking up tomorrow to the smell of her brewing breakfast. And then there was Mark. Mark was my best friend, the guy who had been the best man at my wedding 3 years ago, the guy I used to share cheap pictures of Miller Lite with back in our college days at Ohio State. 3 weeks prior, his life had completely unraveled when his fiancée called off their engagement and kicked him out of their apartment. He had turned up on our porch with 2 duffel bags, a shattered expression, and nowhere else to go in the middle of a brutal housing market. Clara and I didn't even have to debate it. We opened our home to him. We cleared off our big, comfortable L-shaped sectional couch in the living room, bought him his favorite brand of cereal, and told him to take all the time he needed to get back on his feet. We were doing what good friends do. We were being his safety net. When I pushed the front door open, the house was completely dark, save for the faint, flickering blue glow of the television downstairs. The silence was heavy, thick, with the kind of stillness that only exists in the dead of night. I set my rolling suitcase down on the hardwood entryway, taking extra care not to let the wheels click against the floorboards because I didn't want to wake anyone. I slipped off my muddy boots and walked into the kitchen on my socks, my throat parched from the dry car heater. As I poured myself a glass of tap water, I glanced toward the living room. The couch was empty. The gray fleece blanket we had given Mark was pooled on the floor in a messy heap, and his phone charger was dangling uselessly from the wall outlet. I figured he was probably out at some late-night bar trying to drown his sorrows, or maybe he was asleep upstairs in the guest room we used for storage. I swallowed the water, wiped my mouth with the back of my hand, and started walking up the carpeted stairs. The house was cold, the thermostat evidently turned down to save on the heating bill. With every step I took, the wood beneath the carpet gave a tiny, familiar groan. I reached the top landing, turning left toward the master bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was cracked open just an inch, a sliver of warm, dim light spilling out onto the floorboards. It was the light from Clara's bedside lamp, the one with the faded amber shade she insisted on keeping because it reminded her of her grandmother's house. I smiled, thinking she had left it on for herself because she hated sleeping in total darkness when I was away on business trips. I reached out, my fingers wrapping around the cold brass doorknob, intending to push it open quietly, slip inside, and surprise her with a kiss on the forehead. But before my hand could even apply pressure to the wood, I heard a sound that made the blood in my veins turn to absolute ice. It wasn't a loud sound. It was a low, breathless laugh, a soft, intimate sound that I had heard 1,000 times over the last 5 years of my life. It was Clara's laugh, but it wasn't the polite laugh she gave at dinner parties or the loud, boisterous laugh she shared with her sisters. It was her private laugh, the one meant for moments of absolute vulnerability behind closed doors. And then, a second later, came a man's voice, a deep, murmuring rasp that didn't belong to me. "Shut up," the voice whispered, followed by a low, rumbling chuckle. "He's not going to call this late. He thinks you're asleep." It was Mark. My heart didn't just skip a beat. It felt like it violently slammed against my ribs, knocking the wind entirely out of my lungs. The world around me seemed to tilt on its axis, the familiar hallway suddenly morphing into a strange, hostile tunnel. My hand froze on the doorknob. Every single instinct in my body told me to turn around, to run down the stairs, to get into my car and drive until the road ran out, just so I wouldn't have to face whatever reality was waiting on the other side of that door. But my feet were glued to the floor. I was paralyzed by a sick, twisting curiosity that defied all logic. Through the 1-inch gap in the door, I looked inside. The amber lamp cast long, distorted shadows across the bedroom walls. My eyes adjusted to the dimness, and the scene that unfolded before me burned itself into my retina with the agonizing clarity of a car crash. Clara was sitting on the edge of our mattress, her long blonde hair tumbled over her shoulders, wearing the silk robe I had bought her for our anniversary. And standing right in front of her, his hands resting casually on her bare shoulders, was Mark. He was wearing nothing but a pair of gray sweatpants. As I watched, completely incapable of movement, he leaned down and pressed his lips to the side of her neck. Clara let out a soft, trembling sigh, her eyes closing as her fingers reached up to tangle themselves in his dark hair, pulling him closer against her. "I feel so guilty," she whispered, though her actions completely contradicted her words as her hand slid down his chest. "If he ever found out, Mark, it would kill him. He loves you like a brother." "He's never gonna find out," Mark murmured against her skin, his voice dripping with an easy, terrifying confidence that made me want to rip his throat out. "He's 500 miles away in Chicago, probably asleep in some boring hotel room. Forget about him, Clara. Just for tonight. Forget everything." I stood there in the dark hallway, a ghost in my own home, watching my wife and my best friend completely erase my existence with a few words. The betrayal didn't just feel like an emotional blow. It felt physical, like a heavy iron blade twisting deep into my gut, spilling everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and trust onto the cold floor. This was the man I had loaned money to when he was broke. This was the woman I had promised to protect and cherish until death did us part. They were using my bed, my home, and my absence to build a private paradise out of the wreckage of my life. A violent surge of adrenaline in my system, a hot, blinding wave of pure rage that almost made me push the door wide open and scream until my lungs burst. I wanted to tear Mark apart with my bare hands. I wanted to look Clara in the eyes and watch the color drain from her face when she realized she had been caught. But just as quickly as the anger flared, a strange, cold numbness took its place. A chilling clarity washed over me. If I walked in there right now, there would be an explosion. There would be crying, lying, frantic excuses, and a chaotic, messy confrontation that they would have the opportunity to control and manipulate. They would see my tears. They would see my broken heart. And suddenly, I realized I didn't want them to see me break. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of knowing exactly how deeply they had cut me. I slowly, meticulously took my hand off the brass doorknob. I took one step back, then another, moving like a shadow through the dark hallway. I navigated the creaking stairs with the precision of a thief, making absolutely sure not to make a single sound. I grabbed my suitcase from the entryway, picked up my muddy boots, and quietly slipped out the front door, closing it behind me until the latch clicked shut with agonizing softness. The autumn rain was still pouring down when I got back into my crossover SUV. I threw my suitcase into the back seat, started the engine without turning on the headlights, and shifted into reverse. I backed out of my driveway, looking up one last time at the amber glow coming from the second-story window. My hands were shaking so violently against the steering wheel that I could barely keep the car straight as I drove down our quiet, tree-lined suburban street. I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner about 3 miles away from the house. The neon sign buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pink glow across my wet windshield. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring blankly at the dashboard, my mind spinning at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Every memory I had with Clara and Mark over the past few years began to recontextualize itself in the most horrifying way. The long glances across the dinner table, the way she always defended him when he made a mistake, the text messages she would smile at while sitting on the couch. It had been happening right under my nose, and I had been too trusting, too completely blind to see it. But as the initial shock began to recede, leaving behind a hollow, freezing emptiness, a new thought began to take root in my mind. It was a dark, venomous thought, but it was the only thing keeping me from completely falling apart. They thought I was in Chicago. They thought they had until Friday. I looked at my phone on the passenger seat. I didn't call Clara. I didn't text Mark. Instead, I opened my contacts list and scrolled down until I found a name I hadn't looked at in months. It was a woman named Sarah. Sarah was Mark's ex-fiancée, the woman who had kicked him out 3 weeks ago, the woman whose broken heart had supposedly been the reason Mark was sleeping on my couch in the first place. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs as a sinister, elaborate plan began to form in the darkest corners of my mind. They wanted to play a game behind my back. They wanted to treat my life like a joke. I tapped Sarah's name and brought up our text thread. It was time to see just how deep this rabbit hole really went. My thumbs hovered over the glass screen of my phone for a long time, the pink neon light from the diner sign pulsing against the dashboard. The rain showed no signs of stopping, hitting the roof of my SUV in a relentless, rhythmic drumming that felt like a countdown. I needed to know if Sarah knew. I needed to know if Mark's sudden eviction 3 weeks ago was because of his wandering hands, or if she had been left completely in the dark, just like I had been until 20 minutes ago. I typed out a message, my fingers stiff from the cold. "Hey Sarah, sorry to text you so late. It's Logan. I know things have been chaotic lately, but I really need to ask you something about Mark. It's incredibly important. Are you awake?" I didn't expect an answer. It was nearly 1 a.m. on a weeknight, and Sarah worked early shifts as a dental hygienist over in the wealthier suburbs on the east side of town. But less than 30 seconds later, 3 little gray dots started dancing on the screen. "Logan, what's going on? Is he okay?" The fact that her first instinct was to ask if he was okay made a sick knot form in my throat. Even after everything, she still cared about the guy who had destroyed her life. I stared at the text, realizing that a simple message wouldn't be enough for what I needed to do. I couldn't do this over a digital screen. "I'm so sorry to do this, but can I come over?" I typed back. "I'm out driving. I just found out something tonight, Sarah. Something about why Mark is living on my couch." A long pause followed. The dots appeared, disappeared, and then appeared again. Finally, a single line popped up. "Okay, come over. I'm still up." I threw the car into drive and pulled out of the diner parking lot, my tires splashing through deep puddles as I navigated the empty, rain-slicked streets. Sarah lived in a small, rented townhouse about 15 minutes away, located in a quiet subdivision that always smelled like freshly cut grass in the summer and wet leaves in the autumn. As I drove, my mind was firing on all cylinders, the grief and betrayal hardening into something dangerous and calculated. I wasn't the sad, pathetic husband who was going to beg his wife for answers. I was a man who had just been evicted from his own reality, and I was going to find out exactly who had held the match that burned it down. When I pulled up to her townhouse, the porch light was on, casting a lonely yellow square onto the wet concrete driveway. I killed the engine, grabbed my jacket, and walked up the steps, the cold wind biting at my neck. Before I could even knock, the door swung open. Sarah stood there wearing an oversized Ohio State sweatshirt and a pair of dark leggings. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and her eyes were red-rimmed and tired, surrounded by dark circles that told me she hadn't been sleeping much since the breakup. When she looked at my face, whatever question she was about to ask died in her throat. She took a step back, her eyes widening slightly as she took in my disheveled hair, my pale skin, and the hollow look in my eyes. "Logan," she whispered, her voice cracking, "you look like you've seen a ghost. Come inside." I stepped into her warm, clean living room. It was painfully quiet. There were still faint outlines on the walls where photos of her and Mark used to hang, a stark reminder of the life they had been building together for 4 years. She closed the door behind me and locked it, then pointed toward the small kitchen island where a half-empty bottle of red wine and a single glass sat on the granite counter. "Do you want a drink?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "You're shaking." "No," I said, my voice sounding incredibly raspy, even to my own ears. "No, thank you, Sarah. I need to ask you the truth about why you kicked Mark out 3 weeks ago, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Sarah froze, her hand hovering over the wine bottle. She let out a long, ragged breath, her shoulders sagging as if a heavy weight had just been placed on them. She didn't look at me. Instead, she stared down at the dark red liquid in her glass. "Why are you asking me this right now, Logan? It's past 1 a.m. Did he do something?" "I came home early from my business trip tonight," I said, keeping my voice deadpan, completely devoid of the screaming agony inside me. My conference in Chicago got canceled. I walked into my house about 45 minutes ago. I didn't tell them I was coming. Sarah's head snapped up. She looked at me, her lips parting as the pieces of the puzzle began to click together in her mind. The color instantly drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking completely translucent under the harsh kitchen lights. "Oh, God," she breathed, covering her mouth with her hand. "Oh, Logan, no. Please tell me no." "They were in my bed, Sarah," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Mark and Clara, together, in my bedroom, while they thought I was 500 miles away." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the kitchen. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the rain lashing against the kitchen window. Sarah didn't look surprised. She looked devastated, yes, but not shocked. A single tear escaped her eye and rolled down her cheek, catching the kitchen light before she quickly wiped it away with the sleeve of her sweatshirt. "You knew," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical punch to the chest. "You knew about them. That's why you called off the wedding, isn't it?" Sarah sank down onto one of the bar stools at the island, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders began to heave as she started to cry, quiet, muffled sobs that filled the empty kitchen. I stood there, watching her break down, realizing that we were both casualties of the exact same war. We were the collateral damage of two people who didn't care who they destroyed, as long as they got what they wanted. "I didn't know for sure," Sarah sobbed, looking up at me with tear-stained eyes. "I swear to you, Logan, if I had proof, I would have told you. I didn't want to ruin your marriage based on a suspicion." "What did you see?" I demanded, stepping closer to the island, my voice tight. "Tell me everything, Sarah. I need to know." "A month ago, I found texts on his phone," she whispered, her voice shaking violently. It wasn't explicit. There were no pictures, but it was the way they talked to each other. He had her saved under a fake name in his contacts, some guy named Mike from his gym. But I knew Mike's number, and that wasn't it. I called the number from my own phone one day when Mark was in the shower, and Clara answered. She sounded panicked when she heard my voice, and she immediately hung up. She took a shaky sip of her wine, her hands trembling so much the glass clicked against her teeth. When I confronted Mark about it, he flipped out. He called me crazy.
"He said they were just planning a surprise birthday party for you, that they were deleting the texts so you wouldn't accidentally see them on his phone." But I didn't believe him. The vibe between them at our last backyard barbecue, the way she looked at him when you weren't looking, I could feel it in my gut, Logan. I couldn't walk down an aisle and marry a man who made me feel that insecure. So I told him to pack his bags and leave. I told him we were done, and he came straight to my couch, I said, a bitter, twisted laugh escaping my throat. He used his breakup as an excuse to get inside my house, to be closer to her. "I am so sorry," Sarah whispered, reaching across the counter to touch my arm. Her hand was warm, a sharp contrast to the freezing numbness that had taken over my entire body. "I should have called you. I should have told you about the phone number. I was just so humiliated, Logan. I felt like a failure, and I didn't want to drag you into my nightmare if I was wrong." "You weren't wrong," I said, looking down at her hand on my arm. An eerie, calm clarity washed over me. The pain was still there, a massive, bleeding wound in my chest, but the fog of confusion had completely lifted. I knew exactly what I was dealing with now. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a sudden, passionate lapse in judgment because they were lonely. This was a calculated, long-term affair that had destroyed Sarah's engagement and was currently eating my marriage from the inside out. They had lied to us, manipulated us, and made us feel like we were the crazy ones for trusting them. "They think they're so smart," I murmured, staring past Sarah at the dark window. "They think they have until Friday morning before I get back from Chicago." Sarah looked up at me, wiping her eyes. "What are you going to do, Logan? Are you going back there tonight? Are you going to kick him out?" "No," I said, a slow, dark smile spreading across my face for the first time that night. "If I go back there tonight and scream at them, they get to play the victims. They get to cry, pack their bags, and run off into the sunset together, telling everyone that I'm the unstable one. Mark will just move into a new apartment, and Clara will file for divorce and take half of everything I've worked for. They don't get to have a clean exit, Sarah. Not after what they did to us. Sarah frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. Then what are you going to do? They think I'm in Chicago, I repeated, my voice dropping to a low, cold whisper. So as far as they're concerned, I'm still there. But this weekend, there's a massive charity gala for my firm. Clara has been talking about it for months. She bought a new dress. Mark was invited too as my guest before all the breakup stuff happened.
They think they're going to attend with me, playing the roles of the loving wife and the loyal best friend. I looked directly into Sarah's eyes, the plan finalizing itself in my mind like a steel trap closing shut. How would you like to go to a party with me this weekend, Sarah? Because we are going to give them a performance they will never forget. Sarah's eyes locked onto mine, wide with a mixture of terror and sudden, sharp understanding. The kitchen was dead silent for a long moment, the heavy rain outside still drumming against the window glass like an irregular heartbeat. She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting the hem of her oversized Ohio State sweatshirt, before looking back up at me. The raw, broken look in her eyes was slowly being replaced by something else, something cold, focused, and deeply vengeful. A performance, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Logan, if we do this, if we walk into that gala together, there's no turning back. It's going to explode. You know how small this city is. Everyone from your firm, your clients, our mutual friends, they're all going to be there. Good, I said, my voice completely steady, devoid of the shaking panic that had consumed me just an hour ago. Let them watch. They wanted to make a mockery of our lives in the dark, Sarah. They thought they could sneak around, whispering behind our backs, using my house, my bed, and your heartbreak to fuel their little secret paradise. They don't get to do that in the dark anymore. We're going to bring them right into the blinding light. She stood up from the bar stool, walking over to the window and staring out into the black, rainy night. I could see the reflection of her face in the glass, her jaw set tight. For 4 years, she had given everything to Mark, only to be gaslit, lied to, and made to feel like she was losing her mind. I knew exactly what was going through her head, because the exact same venom was pumping through my own veins. The pain was still there, a massive crushing weight in my chest, but the anger had become a scaffolding, holding me upright. What's the plan? She asked quietly, turning around to face me. If you're supposed to be in Chicago until Friday, what do you do until then? I check into a hotel down by the airport, I said, mapping it out in my head as I spoke. Somewhere quiet, somewhere nobody from my office or our social circle will see me. I keep texting Clara exactly like I normally do. I ask her how her day was. I tell her I miss her. I tell her the conference is going great. I let her keep lying to my face. And you do the same. If Mark texts you to complain about his life or check in on you, you play along. Let them think they are completely safe. Let them get comfortable. The more comfortable they are, the harder they're going to fall on Saturday night. Sarah nodded slowly, a dark, dangerous spark igniting in her eyes.
Mark's suit is still in my guest closet, she said, a bitter smile touching her lips. He forgot it when he packed his bags in a hurry. He was planning to come pick it up this week for the gala. I'll make sure it's pressed and ready for him. I'll even text him tomorrow and tell him I left it on the porch so he doesn't have to see me. Perfect, I said. We don't break character, not for a single second. The next 3 days were a masterclass in psychological torture, but not for them, for me. I checked into a generic gray-walled business hotel near the highway, a place that smelled faintly of industrial carpet cleaner and stale air. I spent my days staring at the ceiling, watching the shadows of passing semi-trucks move across the drywall, counting down the hours. Every morning, I had to force my shaking fingers to type out loving text messages to my wife. Good morning, beautiful. Just heading into the first morning seminar. Wish you were here in the hotel bed with me. Miss you. Her replies would come 20 minutes later, always cheerful, always perfectly calculated to keep me unsuspecting. Good morning, babe. Miss you too. Get through those boring meetings so you can come home to me. Love you. Reading those words while knowing she was likely sitting at our kitchen island, drinking coffee that my hard work paid for, while my best friend sat across from her in his sweatpants, made me physically sick.
I had to run to the bathroom more than once, dry heaving into the porcelain bowl, my body rejecting the sheer volume of deceit I was forcing myself to swallow. But I didn't break. I kept the mask firmly glued to my face. On Thursday night, Mark texted me. "Hey man, just checking in. Hope Chicago isn't too brutal. Sticking around the house keeping an eye on things for you. Clara seems a little lonely, but she's holding down the fort. See you Friday night when you get back." I stared at the screen of my phone, a cold, detached laughter echoing in my empty hotel room. "Thanks, brother," I replied. "Appreciate you looking out for her. Truly. Don't know what I'd do without you." By the time Friday evening arrived, I knew I had to play the final stage of the setup. I waited until 6 p.m., the time my flight from Chicago would have supposedly landed at John Glenn International Airport. I sat in my SUV in the airport cell phone lot for an hour just to make sure the timing was perfect, then drove back to my suburban neighborhood. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked completely normal. The autumn rain had finally stopped, leaving the evening air crisp and clear. The lights inside were warm and inviting. If I hadn't come home early on Tuesday night, I would have walked through that front door completely oblivious, a happy husband returning to his beautiful wife and his grateful best friend. I opened the front door, making sure to let the suitcase wheels click loudly against the floorboards this time. "Logan!" Clara's voice called out from the kitchen, sounding genuinely excited. She came running around the corner, wearing a cozy, oversized sweater and jeans, her face lighting up with a brilliant smile that made my stomach turn. She threw her arms around my neck, burying her face in my shoulder. I stood there, my arms freezing for a fraction of a second, before I forced them to wrap around her waist. She smelled like her favorite vanilla perfume, a scent that used to bring me immense comfort, but now smelled like pure poison. "I missed you so much," she murmured, pulling back to look at me, her blue eyes bright and clear. There wasn't a single trace of guilt on her face, not a twitch of the eye, not a hesitation in her voice. She was a professional. "Missed you too, honey," I said, forcing a smile that felt like it was tearing the skin on my face. "Tragic meetings, but I'm glad to be home." Mark walked out of the living room a moment later, holding a bottle of beer. He offered me a warm, close-fisted smile, the kind of smile he'd given me when we won our intramural championship in college, the kind of smile he'd given me right before he gave his best man speech at our wedding. "Welcome back, man," Mark said, walking over and giving me a firm, brotherly clap on the shoulder. "House was quiet without you. Glad you made it back safe." "Thanks, Mark," I said, looking him dead in the eye, watching for any sign of a flinch. There was nothing. He was completely untouchable in his own mind. "Good to see you're still surviving on our couch." "Barely," he laughed, taking a sip of his beer. "But hey, tomorrow night is the big firm gala, right? I picked up my suit from Sarah's porch today. We're still good to go as your +1 party, right? I could use a night out to forget about, well, everything." "Absolutely," I said, nodding smoothly as I picked up my suitcase to head upstairs. "Tomorrow night is going to be unforgettable, Mark, for all of us." Saturday arrived with a slow, agonizing crawl. The charity gala was being held at the grand ballroom of the downtown Hilton, a historic, opulently decorated space with massive crystal chandeliers, towering marble pillars, and a sweeping grand staircase that led down into the main event floor. It was the biggest social event of the year for my real estate firm, attended by city council members, wealthy investors, and every major player in the local business scene. Clara spent the entire afternoon getting ready, doing her makeup in our master bathroom while I sat on the bed, watching her in the mirror. She wore a stunning, backless emerald green dress that hugged every curve of her body, her blonde hair pinned up in an elegant, sophisticated twist. She looked breathtakingly beautiful, the exact image of a successful, supportive corporate wife. Mark was downstairs, looking sharp in a tailored black tuxedo, adjusting his bow tie in the entryway mirror. When we arrived at the Hilton in an Uber, the atmosphere was buzzing. The valet line was packed with luxury cars, and flashes from local event photographers were lighting up the grand lobby. As we walked through the double glass doors, Clara slipped her hand in mine, her fingers interlacing with my own. On my other side, Mark walked with an easy, confident stride, nodding at people he recognized from previous firm events. "Logan, Clara, over here." It was my boss, Arthur, a wealthy man in his late 50s with a glass of champagne in his hand, standing near the center of the ballroom with a group of high-profile clients. "Excuse me for a second, babe,"
I whispered to Clara, squeezing her hand gently. "I need to go say hello to Arthur and the investors before the dinner starts. Why don't you and Mark grab us a round of drinks at the main bar?" "Sure, honey," Clara smiled, giving my cheek a sweet, lingering kiss. "Don't be too long." I watched them walk away toward the massive mahogany bar at the far side of the ballroom. Mark placed a hand on the small of her back to guide her through the crowded floor, a gesture that looked entirely innocent to an outside observer, but to me, it was a blatant display of ownership. I didn't walk over to Arthur.
Instead, I turned around and walked back out toward the grand lobby, my heart hammering a furious, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I pulled out my phone and sent a single text message. "We're by the main bar. It's time." 2 minutes later, the heavy brass entrance doors of the ballroom opened, and Sarah walked in. Sarah looked absolutely breathtaking. She was wearing a midnight blue silk dress that draped elegantly over her frame, her dark hair cascading down her shoulders in soft, polished waves. The exhaustion and sorrow that had weighed her down in her kitchen 3 nights ago were entirely gone, replaced by a razor-sharp confidence. She paused at the top of the grand staircase, her eyes scanning the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns until they locked onto mine. I met her at the bottom of the stairs, offering her my arm. As she slid her hand through my elbow, her grip was tight, a silent acknowledgement that the fuse had been lit and there was no turning back. "Are you ready?" I asked, my voice low and completely steady. "I've been ready for 3 weeks," she whispered back, her jaw set. "Let's finish this." We walked together into the crowded ballroom, moving deliberately toward the main mahogany bar. The room was a blur of clinking champagne flutes, jazz music, and low, upscale chatter. As we drew closer, I could see Clara and Mark standing near the edge of the bar, holding their drinks.
They were laughing at something, their bodies tilted inward toward one another in that subliminal, intimate language I had finally learned to read. Mark had his arm resting casually on the brass railing behind her, his fingers dangerously close to the exposed skin of her backless emerald dress. I didn't stop until Sarah and I were standing exactly 3 feet away from them. "Hey guys," I said, my voice cutting through their laughter. Clara turned around first, a bright, easy smile already forming on her face, assuming I had brought over one of my firm's wealthy investors. But the moment her eyes fell on Sarah, the smile died instantly. Her lips remained slightly parted, her face freezing into a mask of pure shock. Beside her, Mark froze mid-sip, his glass of scotch hovering in front of his mouth as every ounce of color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, translucent gray under the crystal chandeliers. "Sarah?" Mark choked out, his voice cracking as he looked between his ex-fiancée and his best friend. What are you doing here?" "Logan invited me, Mark," Sarah said, her voice remarkably calm, dripping with a terrifying, icy politeness. "He told me you were going to be here tonight, and since you forgot to mention to him why we actually broke up, I thought I'd come along to help clarify things." Clara glanced around frantically, her hands beginning to shake so badly that her champagne glass was rattling against her rings. "Logan, what is this?" she whispered, her voice tight with a rising, panicked anger. "Why would you bring her here? This is an important night for your career. This is completely inappropriate." "Inappropriate?" I let out a low, cold laugh that caused a few people at the neighboring cocktail tables to turn and look. I stepped forward, closing the distance between myself and my wife, looking directly into her wide, terrified blue eyes. "You want to talk about what's inappropriate, Clara? Let's talk about Tuesday night." The mention of the day hit both of them like a physical blow. Clara took a sharp step back, her back hitting the edge of the mahogany bar. Mark's eyes darted around the room, looking for an exit, his chest heaving under his tailored tuxedo. "I didn't stay in Chicago until Friday," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, lethal whisper that carried perfectly over the ambient noise of the ballroom. "I came home on Tuesday night, early. I walked up the stairs, and I stood outside our bedroom door for 5 full minutes, Clara. I watched the 2 of you through the crack in the door. I heard every single word you said. The silence that followed within our small circle was deafening. The jazz music played on, and people laughed in the background, completely oblivious to the fact that a murder-suicide of 2 relationships was happening right in front of them. Clara's mouth opened, but no sound came out. A heavy, suffocating wave of pure guilt and horror washed over her features.
She looked at Mark, then back at me, tears instantly welling up in her eyes. "Logan, please," she sobbed, reaching a trembling hand out toward my jacket. "It's not what you think. Please, let's go home and talk about this. Let's get out of here." "Don't touch me," I said, my voice so cold it made her flinch. "And don't look at him. Look at me." Mark finally found his voice, stepping in front of Clara in a pathetic attempt to play the protector. "Man, listen to me," he stammered, sweat breaking out along his forehead. "You've got it all wrong. She was upset, and I was trying to comfort her. It was a mistake, Logan. We were drunk. I swear to you, I love you like a brother." "You're right, Mark," I interrupted, stepping into his personal space until we were nose to nose. "You were like a brother to me. That's why I gave you a key to my house. That's why I let you sleep on my couch. And you used my trust to crawl into my bed the second my back was turned." I reached into the inside pocket of my tuxedo jacket. I didn't pull out a weapon. I pulled out a thick, white legal envelope and slapped it hard against Mark's chest. He instinctively caught it, his hands trembling. "What is this?" Mark whispered. "That's an eviction notice, drafted by my firm's real estate attorneys," I said, loud enough for the bartender and the nearby guests to hear clearly. "You have exactly until noon tomorrow to get your pathetic duffel bags out of my house. If you are anywhere near my property after 12 o'clock, the police will be waiting to arrest you for trespassing. I've already contacted the locksmith. The locks are being changed at 8 in the morning." Mark stood there, holding the envelope, completely shattered, his reputation and his dignity dissolving in front of the very people he had spent years trying to impress. Then I turned back to Clara. She was crying openly now, the mascara running down her face, ruining the flawless makeup she had spent hours preparing. The emerald dress that had made her look like royalty now just made her look desperately exposed. "And as for you," I said, pulling a second, identical envelope from my jacket and dropping it on the bar right next to her abandoned champagne glass. "Those are divorce papers, irreconcilable differences. I've already moved all of our shared savings into a locked escrow account pending legal division, and my lawyer has copies of the security footage from the driveway, showing exactly how many nights Mark spent upstairs while I was traveling." "Logan, please," Clara begged, her voice cracking as she grabbed the edge of the bar to keep from collapsing. "We can fix this. We can go to counseling. Please don't do this to us. Not like this." "There is no us anymore, Clara," I said, looking at her with an absolute lack of emotion that seemed to terrify her more than any screaming rage ever could. "You and Mark wanted to be together so badly behind my back."
Well, now you can have each other in the light. You can find an apartment together. You can pay for it together. You're welcome to each other's lies. I turned to Sarah, offering her my arm once again. She looked at Clara and Mark one last time, a look of profound, quiet triumph on her face, before sliding her hand back through my elbow. We turned our backs on them, walking away through the crowded ballroom. As we moved toward the grand exit, I could hear the whispers starting behind us, the sudden hush falling over the bar area as the surrounding guests finally realized what had just occurred. I didn't look back. I didn't care what they did, where they went, or how they planned to pick up the pieces of their ruined reputations. When we stepped out of the Hilton into the crisp, cool night air, the city lights were bright and beautiful, reflecting off the damp streets. I took a deep, full breath of air, feeling the crushing weight that had been sitting on my chest for the last 4 days finally lift, leaving behind a clean, empty slate. The betrayal had cut deep, and the scar would remain for the rest of my life. But as I handed my ticket to the valet, I knew one thing for certain. They hadn't broken me. I had broken them.